Hello, everyone. Hunter here at Fossil Creek Nursery, coming here to give you another class, and we're going to be talking about storing your harvest this year. So harvesting vegetables, we talked about this a couple weeks ago. It's very important to harvest at correct times, and to know proper storage techniques. Having your own vegetable garden is really rewarding, and you're able to pick vegetables whenever you want at optimal times. The last session we talked about picking for fresh eating, for things like that. This is going to be specifically more for harvesting and storing for the fall and into the winter time. Harvesting at the correct time is the first step to having a successful lot of food to last you through the winter. And like I said, we had another class a couple weeks ago. You can check out our YouTube video on that. That's for eating or for harvesting for fresh eating. It's a good one. When you're harvesting, just a big thing to look for is making sure you don't have any disease, bruising, damage, pests, or anything like that. Because that disease, that rot, that can actually spread through the rest of your lot, and you will end up losing quite a bit. So definitely something to look for before you think about storing. Um, like I said, yeah, it'll easily spread through if you have it. Say if you had a cold storage or a basement or something, it will easily go through there. So transitioning over to storage and places of storage, there's three different kind of critical temperatures and relative humidity that you want to look for, and it varies between each different variety or different vegetable. So the first one is going to be called a cool and dry storage. It's between 50 degrees and 60 degrees Fahrenheit, and a relative humidity of about 60%. This is kind of like in a basement. Basement is a nice cool and dry space for you to store vegetables. Then there's cold and dry, which is 32 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, 65% relative humidity. This is something you would commonly find in a root cellar. And then cold and moist, it's not as used for as many types of veggies. Really, the biggest one for that is going to be potatoes, which I'll go into a little bit more. But that's going to be 32 to 40 degrees also, but 95% relative humidity, which is quite tough unless you are in a humid environment to reach. But I wanted to definitely point that one out. So basements, as I was saying, they're generally cool and dry. One thing you want to make sure you do is to have ventilation or at least some airflow for your storage. This will help prevent condensation or moisture to infiltrate your vegetables, which will lead to rotting or other issues. Also, of course, protect from rodents. You can use this by using old plastic storage boxes, or things like that, something that rodents couldn't chew through. So moving on, home refrigerators. Home refrigerators are not a great thing to store almost any veggie in. They're good for garlic and onions, but with the refrigerator, it actually promotes pitting and also moisture and condensation getting into the vegetables, such as cucumbers that get mushy in the refrigerator, and that's just because of the quality of the environment itself. And I'll go into more detail about that also. And then root cellars, as I said, it's cold and moist conditions, which is that 32 to 40 degrees with 65% humidity. Um, for this, you can use straw, hay, or wood shavings to insulate. Be sure those wood shavings, hay, and all that aren't infected with disease or have pests or anything, of course, and also that they're not contaminated with pesticides or herbicides or things like that, because you don't want that getting into your food. And then just a quick addendum here, vegetables such as cucumbers, peppers, and tomatoes require cool, which is more close to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, so a little bit higher of a temperature than the others, in a moist condition. So that being said, I'm going to go into specifics, so specific varieties of vegetables, and how to store them. So we'll start off with beans. Beans you want to harvest 2 to 3 weeks after the bloom. and store in cold and moist conditions. So this would ideally be in a root cellar. Um, Beans will develop pitting if they get really cold. So definitely something to look out for. Moving on to basil or kale and celery, and also leafy greens. You want to harvest when the leaves are tender. So with the celery, the top leaves you want to look for them to be tender, and you can put the stems or the bottoms of the leafy greens in water to extend the storage time. It will keep them turgid, so you won't have a loss of color or loss of rigidity to the salad greens or to the celery, which will keep your crunch. And everybody likes crunchy salad. Um, Big thing, basil, if you keep it in the refrigerator for an extended period of time, it will discolor and it will become mushy and not good to eat. So yeah, carrots next. You want to harvest carrots for storage when they're about 1 inch in diameter at the top, so you don't have to actually dig it out. You can kind of scrape away the soil and see the top of that carrot and how big it is getting. Doesn't have to be perfectly an inch, but it's kind of a rule of thumb to go by. They want to be in cold and moist environments, so this is going to be like a root cellar, and you can actually, if stored properly, have a shelf life of up to 8 months. All right, so now we're going to talk about corn. Corn you want to harvest when your silks are dry and brown. Corn is really important. There's a kind of a critical time, especially with sweet corn, to harvest because those sugars in corn quickly turn to starch. So you'll lose a lot of your taste and nutritional value from the corn. And the corn likes to be stored in cold and moist conditions. And if stored properly, they can last several weeks up to 2 to 3 months. And then shelf life, so when you actually take it out, if you're going to properly eat it or even just plan on having a dinner with it in the next couple of days, it'll be okay for 5 days. Big one here, because cucumbers, they can get a little bit finicky with storage. You want to harvest cucumbers when they're young, and we're talking about 6 inches long. Once they get bigger, they become tough. They have less nutritional value to them. And also, what happens is more seeds develop, and these seeds are going to take away from the actual meat that you're going to eat. If they like to be stored in a cool spot, not necessarily in a root cellar, but you want to have it at about 55 degrees Fahrenheit. And put them in perforated plastic bags is a great way to store them. It gives them some breathability, but also gives them protection. I love growing cucumbers, and I have had cucumbers just sitting in my house, average temperature about 70-ish degrees. And I've had a couple that have, they're still perfectly fine, and I've harvested them probably 3 weeks ago. So just an idea. When, on the contrary, I used to put them in the refrigerator because I didn't know any better, right? And after a couple of days, it's just mush. And it's kind of counterintuitive. I'm like, why? I'm trying to store it, but it is what leads it to being mushy. So best to store cucumbers outside of a refrigerator, kind of at a relative to the other storage, a little bit of higher temperature. And as I was talking about, they develop pitting and also the water-soaked areas when it gets below 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And also, it's not good to store with apples or tomatoes. They will, the ethylene gas, which essentially promotes the ripening and eventually the rotting of fruits, they'll cross with each other, and you'll actually end up losing your harvest pretty quick. All right, so now we got onions. You want to harvest onions when the necks are tight and the scales are dry. So the scales, meaning the outside of the onion, the few parts that you don't necessarily eat but peel away when you're cutting them up. Also, you want to cure onions at room temperature. So you'll harvest them, and then you'll let them sit. You can sit them on your counter or whatever. You cure them for 2 to 4 weeks. This lets them dry out. This lets some of those sugars settle and become stable. After that, you can, like I was saying, this is the one thing that you can really store in your refrigerator. and they can last up to 4 months. And also, big one that huge disclaimer: do not freeze onions. It will not. They'll turn into mush when you unfreeze them. Peppers should be harvested whenever your desired size and color is reached. I did talk a little bit more in depth about peppers in the last YouTube video or live video. Just to hit on it, when you're harvesting green peppers, it promotes more pepper growth. When you're waiting until they're red and you start to clip them off, the vigorous amount of growth from your peppers, it will severely drop off. So it's always good if you want more peppers to harvest them earlier when they're green. But like I said, you can check out that other YouTube video, and it goes way more into depth about that. Peppers also like to be in 55 degrees Fahrenheit in the perforated plastic bag. So this is similar to the cucumber. And like the cucumber, peppers will start to pit and get wet spots when they're stored below 45 degrees Fahrenheit. So, and contrary to the cucumbers, which was 40 degrees Fahrenheit, this one's even a little more finicky at 45 degrees Fahrenheit. So definitely do not store peppers in your refrigerator. Peppers, when stored properly, can last 2 weeks or even longer. Stored at room temperature, I've had peppers up to 3 to 4 weeks. Just fine. Potatoes. Potatoes you want to harvest when the vine dies back. So this is later in the season. We're talking almost into November, really. Potatoes are great since they're in the ground. They will last a lot longer than things like tomatoes or cucumbers that when they're going to get zapped by the freeze, that's pretty much the end of the story. They like to be stored in cool, dark, and moist conditions. So this is 32 degrees to 40, and with the high relative humidity of 95%. Yes, this is very difficult to reach 95% humidity, especially at such a cold temperature. Root cellars, generally they get that right temperature, but maybe the relative humidity will be off a little bit. That's fine. Like I said, it's tough to get it to 95% relative humidity unless you have a true, ventilation, refrigeration system that does something like that. And when I'm talking about refrigeration system, I'm talking about something that would be like in a large manufacturer or a growers where they have it specifically set for those settings, not just your basic refrigerator, which is going to be less relative humidity, a little bit colder. A little disclaimer too. If you want to have potatoes for frying as opposed to baked potatoes, mashed potatoes, storing them at a little bit higher temperature of 40 degrees Fahrenheit to 50 will prevent the cold-induced sweetening, and that sweetening will actually encourage discoloration if you fry them. So if we're making fries, potato chips, etc., things like that. So when you're doing that, want to have a little bit higher temperature, less humidity. And then should have said this at the beginning, but when you harvest them, you want to cure them at room temperature for about 2 weeks before you store them. So cure, then store. Did that in the opposite. And potatoes can last 6 months when stored properly. Cool, now pumpkins. So we're getting close to fall, so everybody knows about the pumpkins. Halloween's coming up, and we will have tons and tons of pumpkins here coming up in the next couple weeks. Definitely come check that out. But for harvesting them at your own house, you want to harvest when their shell is hard, but definitely before first frost. Frost or even temperatures below 40 degrees Fahrenheit is highly detrimental to harvested pumpkins. I'm sure you at one point have experienced mushy pumpkins because it got cold outside. That is why. That's what will happen if you have improper storage techniques for them. And pumpkins in the right conditions will last for 2 months. Summer squash, you want to harvest them. This is kind of like cucumbers. You want to harvest them young. 4 to 6 inches long is kind of your optimal harvest time. Also, like cucumbers, they want to be stored in cool, which is 55 degrees Fahrenheit. You can put them in plastic bags from the store, but just cut holes in them, perforate them. Do not store in the refrigerator for more than 4 days. So you can technically put squash in the refrigerator, but not for a long time. And tell you from experience, it ends up not being good, and they turn mushy and nasty, and then it's a whole deal. And then hitting winter squash too, gourds and things like that. Like pumpkins, you want to harvest when the shells are hard before the first frost. Storing in cool and dry conditions. Curing is unnecessarily. There are some varieties that will require curing, but that's very specific things. Usually more hybridized squashes or more unique varieties are going to have different requirements just by the nature of them being hybridized. And winter squashing lasts 2 to 6 months, also depending on variety. And finally, we'll talk about tomatoes real quick. Harvest them when uniformly pink or red. I'm not really talking about green tomatoes in this sense. Just red normal tomatoes. Store at 55 degrees Fahrenheit in the perforated plastic bags. And if you store them, for example, if you store them in a cooler environment, even in a root cellar, the firmness and the color will be lost, and the flavor will also be lost. And also, you can refrigerate them for a short period of time, but never longer than 5 days. So that's all I've got for you. I'm going to open it up for some questions. If you guys have anything, feel free to ask. I'll just wait a couple minutes here to see if anybody's got anything. All right, well, thanks for joining us today. Come see us at Fossil Creek Nursery and check out our awesome selection. Give us a call if you have any more questions. Oh, sorry, looks like we got one. You ever made a root cellar out of an old cooler? When you say cooler, do you mean like a walk-in cooler or just a like fishing cooler? So when I'm talking about root cellars, I'm talking more like a dugout, so something that's actually underground. Um, um, necessarily, I have not done such a something like that, but in theory, because you are having a sealed off container that is buried in the ground, which is important because the ground will help keep that constant temperature. Um, yeah, that seems like it would work for me. The one thing I would definitely be wary of is ventilation, because it's such a small space. The natural ripening of fruits and vegetables and things like that, they'll end up releasing that gas, which can build up and then prevent or encourage rotting. So, in theory, yes, definitely want to think about that. Think about the ventilation. Pitting is when you see spots on the vegetable that have either discolored, have wet spots. They can even develop little holes, things like that. It's a precursor essentially to rot. Yeah, let us know about how that root cellar goes. Be very interested to see because that would be great. That'd be an awesome thing. Cool. If anybody else has got anything, feel free to ask. Cool. Well, I think that's going to be it. Once again, thanks for joining us. Come check us out here at Fossil Creek. We got a lot of awesome stuff here. Like I said, we're going to have pumpkins and all the fall stuff going on. Yeah, we got a lot of exciting things coming up. So come check us out. And also, if you guys think of any questions or anything, just feel free to give us a call. We're here to answer. Yeah, have a great day. Thanks, guys.